welcome. I'm afraid we're the ones who braved the rain to get here today, so that's nice. Before introducing Vienna, and we've got our online audience as well, I'm just going to briefly mention what's happening next week. So next week we've got Henry Levers, who's from Synergy, which is a startup company, and he's talking about microgrids, opportunities for microgrids to increase renewable energy deployment and overcome grid constraints for real estate developments. So obviously, there's, as usual, there's full details online, but that's who we've got next week, which will be interesting. So today we're very pleased to introduce Fiona Brocklehurst. Quite a number of us know Fiona. She's kind of been working in this space for quite some time. She's an independent sustainable energy consultant. In the dim and distant past, used to work at AEA Technology, based out at Harwell, presumably, yeah. But she's been independent since 2010, and she's done a lot of work for numerous sort of international public sector organisations and governments, the US government, UK, various EU governments, Australian government, and the International Energy Agency. She always brings a really interesting angles to her work and tells us things that other people haven't found out. So I'm really looking forward to this today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nav. Good afternoon, everybody. So yes, you can see the title there. It's about fairness. So just very quickly, what I'm going to talk about, very quickly about me, why fairness matters, why energy efficiency appliance policy matters. That's what I'm talking about. Two of the types of justice, procedural and distributional justice. And then I've said summary and conclusions, but it's actually kind of more recommendations thinking about it. So starting off, it's amazing what you can find in research online. You can buy a mug or a t-shirt or anything like that. I'm independent, mostly working in policy support, research and evaluation, largely on appliance policy. Over the years, I've self-funded some research on a number of topics, and occasionally present bits on them at conferences. And this work was presented at the British Institute of Energy Economics in September at the research conference. So why fairness matters. So it is something I'm pretty passionate about. And I don't really know why, but I have a feeling it might be the fact that I was the youngest of three children. So when I was a child, that was my cat pretty much all the time. And I realise you don't have to be a youngest child to bring that out, but it felt particularly that I was the one who was getting the short stick. But it isn't just about, my feeling of justice isn't about just my justice, it does apply to other people, it's not. So that's kind of the root of it, but why should everyone care about justice in the wider world? And when I was looking around for post-justifications, I found what I thought was this really good quote from Friends of the Earth. It is right in lots of ways, economically, legally, morally, but it also gives political legitimacy. And if people don't, it's not only just, is it fair? If it's seen to be fair, if it's not seen to be fair, it's not going to work. And that's a photo of the Gilets jaunes protests in Paris a few years ago. So that's kind of, I have a couple of policy people who are a bit sort of dismissive of it and think it's all a bit woke, and I don't know, but to me, I think it really is important. And other people think it's important too. So this is a Eurobarometer surveys that they do, big international EU representational surveys, are very robust. And one of the questions at that time was, do you support a green transition that leaves no one behind? And vast majority, 88% people said yes. So moving on from the general to the specifics, why energy efficiency appliance policy. Before I answer that question, I think I need to just make sure that I tell you what EU appliance policy is. And at the EU level, there's basically two policies which work together in harmony. There is the Eco Design Directive, which sets minimum standards. So that's a form of what's in the wider world internationally known as a minimum energy performance standard, or a MEPS, a bit more snappy. It was called eco-design because there are the aspiration is to include other impacts, not just energy, and it certainly has always addressed, say, water for a dishwasher or washing machine, and is starting to incorporate repairability and other aspects. And then, so that you can see it's slightly confusing graph, and that the efficiency is going to the left, so you can think of it as energy to the right. So you're trying to go to the left here. So the MEPS cuts a line so that everything has to be above that. And then in tandem with that, you have the energy label, which I think hopefully is familiar to everybody. It's been around since the mid-90s. And that's gives scope for showing what the best is, not just what the minimum is, and that pulls the market, and together they gradually transform. So that's what we're talking about. So why is that important? So one aspect is it's really effective. It saves massive amounts of energy. This is from a sort of review looking at evaluations of these types of policies internationally, that came out by the IEA, came out about 5 years ago. And you can see hundreds of terawatt hours per year in the EU, and 15% of electricity. And that's just electricity. It also affects all the fossil fuels that are used for heat, so gas, oil, coal, wood. There's more of that. So that's, and obviously associated with that is carbon emissions reductions. Then it's also incredibly cost effective, really high sort of cost-benefit ratios, benefit-cost ratios rather, you know, more than 4 routinely, which is quite rare in energy efficiency, or you know, most policies, to be honest. Then last but not least, it covers a huge number of consumer products. So there can't be many people in the UK certainly that don't have at least one of those products, and most of us have most of them, to be honest. So it affects your everyday life, even if you may not be aware of it. And so having consumer representation, having involvement in it is therefore really important, because it's going to affect you even if you're not aware of it. So when I was, when you look at energy justice, this is the classic try you get. Procedural justice is access to information and decision making. Distributional justice is benefits and disbenefits, are they evenly distributed, fairly distributed? And recognition justice is acknowledging vulnerability and needs. So I'm mostly going to talk, as I said at the beginning, about procedural and distributional, and just kind of touch on recognition justice. So starting with procedural justice, actually, we need, before we get to the standards and the labels, we need to go a step back. So maybe because I'm a physicist by training, I go stage 0 because of zero laws and stuff. So stage 0, before you can have a good energy label or performance standards, you need to have a test standard. Otherwise, anybody can claim anything. So everybody has to agree, you know, the temperature, the procedure, in order to get consistent values. Which means in terms of your procedure, ideally, you want procedural justice in the test standard system, not just in the regulatory, the policy system. That isn't straightforward in that it takes a lot of resources, time going to meetings, looking at data, other resources, buying market data, running loads of tests, paying for round-robin tests, so that trying to check that the test standards are robust and repeatable. All of which means that most of the people on the working groups who make the standards are industry. And that you know, they manufacture the products. In some ways that you know, it's very appropriate they're involved because they know what they're doing, but obviously they also have their own agenda. But a little green slice of the pie chart, NGOs, and in this area, there's a European NGO, which is not actually dedicated to representing consumers on standards, test standards. They kind of started out in safety area and then they've moved into the environmental area, so that's kind of developed. And what is more, they get some funding from the European Commission to do this in recognition of the fact that this is an important role. And I really didn't know about that, and possibly probably wouldn't have included in this presentation. I'd done it about 18 months ago, but for the last year, I have been working on dishwashers, representing ANEC on working groups on energy and water, and one on material efficiency, which means repairability and robustness. So, yeah, we are in there. And then moving on to developing the actual policies, it's quite a long and tortuous road to get from the idea to actually getting adopted. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk you through all of this. And the bits that are relevant are the ones that are ringed in red. So looking at those, you have the working plan initially, and that's where they set over the next, I think it's 5-year plans, which products are going to be investigated, which new ones are going to be investigated. Then when that happens, the Commission gets consultants to do a preparatory study. I'm going to tell you some more about that in a minute, where the actual more of the detail of the policies developed, kind of what's exactly in scope and what's out of scope and what's the reason for that, where should the energy levels be set, are there any other things that should be regulated, and then once those get to the draft stage, they get considered again in a consultation forum, and most of the detail is then fixed. There are those other stages going on then, so things do get fine-tuned. So both the working plan and the consultation forum are the decision-making body for that is called the consultation forum. So here's another pie chart showing another split of representation. And again, you've got trade and business, industry in there in the majority. You've got a bigger slice of NGOs, and that includes consumer, but also environmental NGOs, and various other organisations. Consumers are represented by ANEC, it's that same organisation on there, but there's also a pan-European consumer organisation representation called BUC, was possible to say, who represent people like the WITCH in the UK, so that all the national ones, but there are regional ones and transnational ones. And both ANEC and BUC do get support from the Commission in order to support their involvement. So those are the kind of formal bookends to this. In between, we had this preparatory study. And this is actually the best opportunity to influence what goes through, because this is where you start almost with a blank piece of paper. It's kind of what should be in, what shouldn't be in, and you're coming up with a proposal at the end for setting levels and what should be scope. So while the consultation forum is the formal point and it is still possible to change things, everybody's invested a lot, including the Commission have done an impact assessment by the time you get to that point. So really to really get something changed at that point, you're going to have a red hot, absolute, killer of a reason why not. Whereas here, things are much more malleable, there's much more scope. And some consultation is built in. So at various stages, the consultants will sort of ask for evidence. And then there are normally at least 2 stakeholder meetings where if they present what they've found so far, and there's the opportunity to ask questions and comment and draft reports and so on. There's a few problems with that from in terms of consumer representation. One is there's no public announcement that these studies are going on anywhere. So members of the consultation forum get told, and quite often, though not always, there's a website where they put information up. But not only do they not, you don't get any notification, even if you know there's a study going on. My experience is Google does not find these studies, these websites. It's almost impossible. You generally have to find somebody who already knows about it, and they send you the site, the web address. So that's a problem. And then you say, well, they're doing a lot of consultation. How does that work? The consultants need industry to tell them about technical details, about market details. So they will approach them and actively solicit them to give them information. There's no compunction and there's no real immediate value to them in doing the same to the NGOs, the consumer associations. So that's a big sort of issue. And then the other side of this is these are very technical studies. The actual people who work directly for ANEC and Buick aren't technical experts. They have to cover, 10 different products and safety and whatever. So they can't do it themselves. They need access to experts. And again, they do get funding for that, but they need the experts to be independent of industry, and finding someone who knows enough about these products to be useful, but doesn't have an axe to grind because they've been involved in industry can be quite difficult. It's quite a small pool. So that's the kind of formal thing. There is another consultation channel which applies for every European policy pretty much, and it's called Have Your Say. And it's very easy to use. You just register and put in your email address. You don't have to live near you. You don't, it's completely open. You then get notified of something that you can have your say about. But it's not, you can't narrow down too much what you want to do. So you've got to live with the irritation of getting told about things that you have absolutely no interest in. Not the end of the world. With this product policy process, you tend to get told when there are calls for evidence, but then there's no connection to actually the preparatory study. It doesn't say, or when there's a draft regulation. And like I say, you can put your 2 you can do it in any EU official language. You can decide whether to make your contribution public or not. But how much notice anybody actually takes of that, if you're just Joe Blogs or you're whatever, I have no idea. So it's there, but it's just to kind of make the point is, as I already had about the expertise, is there are all these products. All of them quite distinct, all of them they're in particular issues. So it's a difficult thing to manage. So altogether, what's my kind of verdict on the procedure? So there are some good sides. Consumers are represented by NGOs, and there is funding to help them do that. It is possible. There are mechanisms for individuals and other organisations to express their views. On the other hand, these are complex, and it's difficult for somebody who isn't an expert to speak about it in a meaningful way. There are a lot of products to keep track of, and there's no announcement about preparatory studies to get involved. So that's, to my mind, quite an issue. So moving on to the distributional justice, slice of the cake. Back to this preparatory study again. So there's one of these tasks is the design options, and it's trying to find the least life cycle. There's too many different variations. What's it? Life cycle costs. There's different people use LLCC or whatever. Anyway, so the idea is you look at the different technical options for a particular piece of equipment, and you say, okay, this one's more expensive, but it saves more energy. You're balancing the initial cost of something, which, especially if it's a new feature, you don't really know how much it's going to cost, so you just kind of got to make a informed guess. And then you say, okay, that saves this much energy over its lifetime, so, you know, how does that stack up? And then the methodology is you choose the one with the least life cycle cost. So it's kind of built in that, in principle, these always save everybody money. That's what it did. So that's the idea. How does that work? Does that work? So there have been a number of studies. One big one in the US looked at 9 products and found that although the prediction was the initial cost was going to be quite a lot higher, the mean cost was minimal, and therefore obviously the payback was quite good. Another one looking just at clothes washers found kind of the same, actually found the purchase prices decreased, not that they didn't go up much, they just actually decreased. And then along the same sort of line, an Australian study found that the number and the range of models increased, but that's a concern. You know, they say, well, if you bring in this thing, people aren't going to make so many, it's not going to be as much choice. Well, that wasn't the case. And you get a 40% in energy reduction combined with a substantial price reduction. So overall, these look like they're working out. However, I don't know of any studies that have actually looked at the EU and checked that this is also working in the EU. Now, okay, there's no particular reason why it shouldn't work, but it would be nice to know that, wouldn't it? You think? So that's the kind of, like I say, the on average picture. What about people with different income levels? So I only found one study on MEPS, the minimum performance standards, and it was in the US, looking at washing machines again, popular product, looking at efficiency and price for the different segments. So we've got 2 graphs. One of them is the price at the top and the efficiency at the bottom. So you've got 3 different types of washing machine, and then we've obviously got time. And the first sort of vertical line is when the regulation came in. So the basic, cheapo, lowest efficiency ones bumping along the bottom got more efficient at the point where the regulation came in. Good, not surprised though. And the price didn't change. The interesting one is this middle line, which is substantially higher efficiency, as you can see, and goes along. And the price of that falls really dramatically over that period, such that by the end of the study period, it's the same price as the low efficiency models, lowest efficiency model. So they found that the lowest income people had more choice and much greater energy efficiency at the end of that process. So that's a really positive story. Energy labels, once again, new one. Washing machines again. So that was at a point where the MEPs changed, but also it's called revalorized. The labels changed from A plus to G to age G. And they found that the manufacturers really responded to that. They didn't like having their all their models down in F and G. They put a little F in, but it's still a competitive market. So essentially, there was no green premium for a higher rated product. So they concluded that this was really good for low-income consumers because they could then afford high efficiency machines. So again, positive story. Everything in the garden looks lovely, except what happens when you get products that have the same function, but for one reason or another have a different set of users. And this was an American group of researchers. They decided to look at washing machines again and tumble dryers. So there is a very interesting, to people like us, survey in the US where they ask people what type of products they use, how much energy they use, and their income, critically. So they could actually say the people who use laundrettes and in whether not commercial or in a lot of people live in apartment buildings when they have a laundrette in their building, so not necessarily having to go to one down the road kind of thing, were used by low income households, and the people who have one in their own home are medium or high income households. And there is a real gap in terms of how these are regulated in the US. So washing machines and tumble dryers have been regulated for a very long time. Whereas the large ones used in laundrettes have been regulated. Some of them have only been regulated a few years. Quite a lot of them aren't regulated at all. If they're set above a certain size, they're not regulated. All of which means that they are less efficient, those large machines. And the people, low-income people, least able to pay, are paying the most for their washing and drying. Not a happy situation. So that made me think, well, what's the situation in the EU? So I know that the equipment regulatory situation is the same in the EU, in fact, in some ways even worse, and that there are no NEPs for any of the machines that are used in commercial laundrettes. They did try a long time ago, and then they went, oops, we haven't got a test standard yet, so we can't do it. It is underway, happily, but by the time they actually take effect, it's probably going to be towards the end of this decade. Whereas domestic washing machines and tumble dryers have had labels for a very long time, and then it's the first ones, and have these NEPs since 2010. So definitely the energy efficiency of the large machines is worse than the domestic machines. I couldn't find any equivalent data that the US have in terms of who uses laundrettes. My sort of suspicion is that it's the same as in the US. It's people, you know, who are on lower income. But I know that washing machine ownership is actually really, really high. So there you go. So again, we've got an evidence gap there. But my suspicion is that the situation is the same in. Then the same group of researchers decided to look in the US at heating and cooling. And again, you've got a structural difference in the housing market. So low-income people tend to live in rent, and they tend to live in multifamily residences and manufactured homes. And the types of heating, and those do different in that compared to single family homes, are very different in cooling. And you get the same sort of pattern of the home being more efficient, more regulated, and therefore more efficient, and the ones in multifamily and manufactured being less regulated and less efficient. So again, they found the same pattern of those least able to pay, paying the most, and as you know, we're all very familiar with the fact that that generally means that people don't cool themselves or heat themselves enough, and then you've got loads of health issues and other problems. I don't think, again, no data, I don't think this carries over as much to the EU. Our regulations tend to be more across products with the same function. So we try and do all the heating together, all the cooling together, so you don't get the same room for these distinctions. And part of the issue with the US regulations was that they take a long, some regulations only basically don't get reviewed, whereas in principle, all the EU ones are reviewed every 5 years. So I think from the regulatory situation, it's not as bad, but also the type of housing that people have is much more in Europe, my impression, to do with the country you live in and, you know, which part of the country you live in than necessarily income. And I don't know, but hopefully we have more social housing than the US, where somebody's paying attention to that. So my judgment on distribution, some plus points again, is they're designed so that everybody benefits. And from what we can see, though there's no EU studies, it does seem to work that way. And in fact, it's better. And that reflects that cost effectiveness and those energy savings values that right at the beginning I was talking about. The one study I found that actually looked at the effects of MEPS on distribution found that consumers benefited more, so that's good. And the look at the washing machine labels, there's a typo there, found low income benefited. On the other hand, there's almost no post evaluation in the EU that I found. There is an issue definitely in the US with coverage of products that are used preferentially by low income consumers. And there's some reasons to believe that for at least one of those product groups, that's the same in the EU. Then we come on to recognitional justice. So I've read around about it and I found it quite difficult to kind of pin down. And I don't think I'm the only one, because when I was looking back in last year, I only found a couple of papers at all talking about energy efficiency and recognitional justice. I have since seen the papers written by Nick and bunch of other people looking at racialization, and that was really informative. So it is obviously getting more looked at. But so that is in sort of conventional energy efficiency in terms of housing and so on. That's easier to kind of understand what's happening. But I'm struggling to think, so that's my evidence gap again, struggling to think how it would apply to appliances. And the only thing that I've been able to come up with is that all of these policies only apply to mains connected appliances. But if you're living entirely on an arrowboat or a caravan or something like that, and there are obviously traveling people who do that, then you don't get any help, you're on your own. So it's a sort of consumer electronics, but certainly anything heating, lighting side of things, you don't get any, and yeah, nobody's looked at it. So there's nothing to review. So this is what I would like. I would like, please, more research on the EU, on what's going on. Are there product groups where there is this differential usage with the different products that are regulated differently? And what groups have needs which are different in this particular area appliances that aren't being recognised. And then in terms of procedures, when you're looking at the product coverage, coming up with this working plan, then it will be helpful to think about these distributional routes, the fact that if different people are using different products, to make sure that you're thinking about that. And then just please increase the transparency of when there's the study going on and make it easier for people to engage. I mean, I kind of get it in that, you know, if you have your main site that says, here are these regulations and it's all working rightfully well, and go and buy your high label products, you know, you don't want them to say, well, by the way, we're going to change everything in a few years. But there's got to be a way, but there's got to be somewhere between that and, you know, having to know somebody who knows something to be able to find out what's going on. And then this is courtesy really of Brenda, a much more radical idea, but is completely valid. All of these regulations only apply to new products, whereas second-hand goods are quite commonly, you know, refurbished and sold to low-income people because they're a lot cheaper than buying new, but they can be horrendously inefficient. So if you could, it's not going to be easy. You haven't got this really nice, neat supply chains in the same way you have with new products. But if you could address that, then that's potentially sort of plugging a gap that's there at the moment. And it also, you know, circular economy, trying to bring in more, trying to get more repairability. Then it's not just that something is repaired and then runs for 10 years. You want it to be repaired and to be efficient. So it kind of ties into to my mind, into the greater move to circular economy. And that's it.